I'm Alex. I am a graduate from Sheridan's Interaction Design program, the class of 2020. I've been very fortunate during my degree to have had the opportunity to work at 2 professional product design jobs. The first, for about 6 months at a healthcare startup called Smile Clinical Data Repository in Toronto, and the second as a product design intern at Facebook in their London, England office, where I'll be returning full-time this summer. I discovered interaction design when I was studying fundamental arts here at Sheridan, but I actually began my academic career in philosophy. I graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from the University of Prince Edward Island in 2015. When I tell people that I studied philosophy, I get a lot of funny reactions. Often it's, really? Or why? Most say something like, I have no idea what that means, but cool. A few people also studied philosophy, and they politely ask me not to remind them of it. So now I am prepared with an answer. Usually I tell people that I went into philosophy because I planned on studying law. That's only half true. By the end of my degree, and before I accepted that my creativity was not a baby tooth, but a vertebrae, I really did plan on continuing into law. But that's not why I went into it. I actually planned on being an English major until I took my first philosophy course. It was called Critical Thinking, and I fell in love with it. I was one of those kids that my mother playfully calls a willful child. I walked around with this baggage of big questions about life, the universe, and everything, and my general uncertainty was growing into general anxiety. For me, the promise of philosophy was the promise of answers. That critical thinking class introduced a new concept to me, something that would become a core component of my degree: formal logic. So formal logic is the practice of breaking down the patterns behind human reasoning in order to prove validity in arguments. It'll probably look familiar to you if you're familiar with programming, or data science, or mathematics. To 18-year-old me, it was one of the coolest things I had ever seen, and that tells you a lot about how I spend my Friday nights. It was cool because I thought I had stumbled upon a secret language that leads to truth. I was going to have a superpower, making me capable of winning every argument forever. I was at the gateway to answers, which is another way of saying I thought I was on the path to objective truth. And yes, it was apparently lost on young me that even though philosophy had been around for 30 centuries at this point, 2015 would be the time we figured it all out. And not to spoil the rest of this presentation, but we did not. So of course, over the years, reality did sink in, because objective truth never seemed to materialize, and I started noticing patterns in my study of academic philosophy. I took a class called Skepticism, Agnosticism, Atheism, and Belief. A pretty loaded topic, as you can imagine. The professor would occasionally lead class with a statement. Something like, for this class, we are going to accept absolutely that God exists, or that God doesn't exist. It became clear that he had to do this, or else meaningful conversation could barely even begin. He had to do this because arguments about ideas don't start from a neutral position. They start with a foundation built up of all of our preconceived beliefs, grown out of our experiences and perspectives. The ideas that you take into an argument influence the ideas that you take out of one. In other words, a discussion will probably not change your belief in God, but your belief in God will affect how you have that discussion. This is the pattern I began to see. All philosophical arguments are never-ending, because all philosophical arguments are delicate chemical reactions made up of the people and the places they are born into. And this matters. Philosophy is an infinite back and forth of ideas, and philosophers can draw entirely different conclusions from the same argument. The reason this matters, the reason that I'm talking about it here, is because philosophy is really just the study of how people think, and that is the backbone of design. The reactions I get when I tell people I studied philosophy have shown me that a lot of people seem to feel detached from the concept of what philosophy is. But you're affected by it every day. And as designers, you take part in it every day. So it's important to understand what that means. We use the conclusions of philosophical arguments as foundations for real-world decisions. And knowing that those arguments are never ending means those foundations are a lot less firm than we'd like to believe, including the ones we'd sometimes rather not think about, like our political system, our educational system, our legal system. If you think about philosophy as being some kind of engine, I see it this way. Lots of ideas and facts and events get fed into the engine and are processed. Processing is basically a lot of thinking, discussing, arguing, based on ethics, morals, values, logic. Those original ideas inside that engine will continue to evolve and morph for as long as they're in there. But at some point, we have to squeeze something out of that engine and use it as the evidence behind real-world decisions. Like, what should we do when someone steals? It's sometimes hard to remember just how fragile our legal system is, because it feels so grounded in reality. Right and wrong can occasionally be simple. Stealing because you're bored, we pretty unanimously agree that shouldn't be allowed. But what about stealing something that was stolen from you? Stealing accidentally? What about stealing if your parents raised you to believe it was okay? How do we even define the ownership of a family heirloom or a fruit tree or a gift that was taken back? This kind of thinking is the nature of philosophy, and I think that idea gets lost a lot, and I have evidence. In my second year of interaction design, I had an art director look at my resume, point at my bachelor's degree, and ask with absolutely no humor in his voice, "Name your top 3 philosophers and their best works." He was testing me to see if I'd really studied philosophy, but I found that to be a strange metric. I don't see the value in quoting outdated philosophers when some of them sound like this. What the academic study of philosophy did for me was not to give me a Rolodex of published authors to name drop at cocktail parties, or a dictionary of terms to recite, or a library of arguments to pull from like a toolkit. I haven't touched formal logic in a half-decade, and I wouldn't be able to do this anymore. What it did for me, what I'm trying to share, was that it helped me to recognize my own dangerous belief in the concept of truth. A belief that was echoing into blind trust in the systems around me, because those systems looked valid. What it did for me was to teach me that something can be valid without being true. See, that kid that was super excited about formal logic believed that the engine eventually reached a conclusion and spit out some version of truth, like an algorithm, when the reality is that it just spits out best guesses because we force it to. The reality is that we didn't write laws around stealing because the discussion about stealing was over. We wrote the laws because people were stealing. And we don't design interactions because we've determined the best interactions to design. We design interactions because people are buying them. The engine is not a formula. It's an evolutionary process. Law and interaction design follow similar life cycles. They both start with discussion and argument about how people live their lives, what happiness is, what we should or shouldn't let people do. And like law in interaction design, we eventually have to make a decision, because things have to ship. It's baked into one of the most famous lines in design. Interaction design and legal systems and religious practices, they're all literal expressions of philosophical thought. And the problem with philosophical thought, even something as core as my beloved formal logic, is that it's only as effective as its foundation. And human reasoning is at its core imperfect. Something can be valid without being true. Every love story is a tragedy if you wait long enough. Every argument is countered if you wait long enough. And every design has the power to cause harm if you wait long enough. It's the waiting that can be the problem. I started studying interaction design with the same problematic expectation as I did with philosophy. I believed that somewhere on the horizon was a point where, if I studied enough, I would start making all the right decisions in design. A year ago, I lived in blissful ignorance that the people building these massively influential products knew exactly what they were doing. And then one of them hired me. What if I don't know what I'm doing? But I remembered a time I felt this way before. I was with one of my mentors in philosophy. I confessed to him that I was having a difficult time. As part of the class, we had to write essays arguing for or against other arguments from 20th century philosophy, based on what we learned. And I told him how I felt almost foolish doing that. What could I say that hasn't been said? Argue that hasn't been argued? The more you learn about this field, the more daunting it becomes. It seems like every possible facet of human thought has been deeply examined, re-examined, and scrutinized. Who am I, some kid after a few years, to believe that my voice has any weight against the people who have studied for decades, let alone the 3,000 years that came before? He smiled and said, "Alex, I have to teach it. Imagine how I feel." And he went on to explain something that I've heard many times since. It does not matter how old a field is. Thoughts will always require new thinkers, because the discussion is never over. Here's a different line we can use, a different approach we could take. Interaction design is never right. On its surface, this may seem pessimistic because we tend to tie the idea of right with the idea of good, and we tend to assume that if something isn't right, it is therefore wrong. But that's not always true, and I actually find this quite beautiful. How can I get it right on a design for 1/3 of the human race? How can anyone? We can't. No one can. No one has. Designers have to make decisions. We have to pull from the engine eventually, or we'd never ship anything. Decisions are acceptable. What is unacceptable is to ever believe the decisions we've made, the decisions that are common practice in technology today, are true simply because they're currently valid. Believing that design can be right means believing that some of the design out there is untouchable. Believing that design can never be right means that everywhere you look contains the potential for innovation. It means that the capacity for originality is infinite. It means that every new designer has the right, the privilege, and the obligation to contribute something new to this industry. So go finish your work, find out why it's not right, then do better. Thank you.